Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 17th of February, and after 9 years of fighting and a battle that's lasted nearly 2 years, Avdiivka is now in full Russian hands. In today's video, we'll start off with a timeline of events over the past 2 days, reflection on the battle, and we'll look at what's to come more generally, and of course then I'll elaborate on that in future videos. Let's go back to the 15th of February. On this day, the Russians expanded their salient to the west of Industrial Avenue, and this is a key event because this gave the Russians a forward base to attack towards Lasochkine, but also it put them very, very close to the remaining dirt roads that the Ukrainians had under their control that were used as a corridor to retreat from the 9th district and from the wider city of Avdiivka. And so by getting these positions, the Russians were able to, for a sustained period of time, use their small arms fire and use actually tank fire to target the Ukrainian forces directly as they were withdrawing along this road. And this sped up the Ukrainian retreat process, and that also caused it to become even more disorganized and led to additional casualties for the Ukrainian forces during their endeavor. But let's look at when the Ukrainians actually started withdrawing. So before the Ukrainian withdrawal started, there were about 5,000 to 6,000 men within the city of Avdiivka itself. So within the confines of this perimeter, generally, you could say. And additionally, you had about 1,000 Ukrainian forces in the coke plant, so a 7,000 man garrison. And as the Russians were closing in from the north about 10 days ago, the Ukrainians did make the decision as an operational grouping to begin the withdrawal, and that is why Azov was sent in the first place. Azov was sent in to provide a blocking power, to create this blocking maneuver that would hold back the Russians to the best of their ability. There were actually attempts by the 1st Assault Battalion of this unit to create a localized counterattack in the northern parts of the residential area just to the south of the coke plant. Of course, after a short battle, that attempt was repelled, and he also had similar attempts at least holding the line along Industrial Avenue and to the south of it by the 2nd Assault Battalion of this unit. Those were a failure in the end. The Russian forces were able to push back the Azov units, but in the short period of time when the Azov brigade was able to resist, it did give a window of opportunity of about a week for the Ukrainian forces to conduct their withdrawal. And so during that time period, you had thousands of Ukrainian troops that were retreating. Before Industrial Avenue was cut off, they were retreating along the paved road. And after that point, you had some that were retreating along this road directly into Lasochkine. And then the last ones out had to retreat, of course, through the dirt road that leads directly from the 9th district into Severna. And in the most desperate of cases, the ones that were still in the 9th district had to leave through this southern dirt road and go north and then take a west into Severna. Of course, you did have some Ukrainian forces that withdrew along open fields. The ones that retreated earlier on, like 10 days ago, they were able to do so in private vehicles. No large vehicles or a very small amount were used in the withdrawal process. If there were infantry fighting vehicles that were used, then it was likely the 3rd Assault Brigade that was withdrawing from Azov that were using them. They were using their Western supplied Bradleys or MRAPs to withdraw. But besides that, the actual Ukrainian garrison in Avdiivka were either using private vehicles and then later on doing so by foot. And so to get back to the 15th of February, by that period, there were only about 2,000 Ukrainian forces left within Avdiivka and then another 1,000 likely within the coke plant. And so they had to desperately leave because the Russian forces were closing in, putting pressure on them. And so the Ukrainians were definitely routed. The process by which they withdrew, I'll lay out now. So the first step was to evacuate the forward positions in the eastern part, just to the east of the city itself. And so you saw the Ukrainians evacuating the Donetsk filtration plant. They evacuated, of course, the Zenit facility. That is something that happened earlier. And in that withdrawal, the Ukrainians did also incur heavy casualties from the 110th Mechanized Brigade. There was a withdrawal from trenches that are located within this forested patch over here that resisted for a very long time, but those trenches had to be abandoned. Also, a lot of Ukraine's forward positions in dachas that are located near the highway to the south of Kamyanka, or in the dachas that are in eastern Avdiivka, those were also abandoned. And this was the first stage. And in these operations, in some cases, you had wounded soldiers that could not be evacuated, so they were left behind. And of course, you had a lot of ammunition and heavy equipment that had to be kept at the front line that the Ukrainians can no longer use, that is being captured by the Russians at this very moment. And so then you had this coalescing of Ukrainian forces during the withdrawal in the city center. And as this was going on, and I'm talking now by the 15th of February, you had extremely heavy bombardment by the Russian forces by air and artillery. You had probably close to 100 on a daily basis, Fab 500 and Fab 1500 bombs being dropped on the Ukrainians as they were withdrawing, and they were doing so in the open. And this was going on during daytime, especially, and that's the most dangerous time to be withdrawing. But it was extremely necessary because the Ukrainians had no time to spare. So eventually they made it to the 9th district. And as these Ukrainian forces, and we're talking now in the hundreds, if not the thousands, as they were making it towards the 9th district, you had the Azov Brigade, or at least 2nd Battalion, holding the northern flank to give them as much time as possible. And so there were heavy battles between Azov and the Russian soldiers that were advancing in this direction. And eventually, Azov was pushed back. Some of their soldiers were actually captured in the process of these battles. And we're going to get more into that later on in the video. It was the hope of Siersky and potentially also Tarnovsky, who is in charge of the Ukrainian sector in Avdiivka, that potentially the Ukrainians could have held onto the 9th district for an extended period of time to at least try to further hold onto the city and deter Russian forces. But as the Russian forces were clearly having the initiative advancing from the south towards the 9th district, and from the north, the Azov Brigade was not able to hold back the Russians, with the Russians closing in on their logistical supply lines, closing in on any sort of corridor for retreat. They did have to publicly announce on the 16th of February that there was an order to retreat further westwards towards the next offensive line. And so on the night of February 16th, that was the last major chance for Ukrainian forces to leave the city. And they did this in rather small groups. They were able to do so mainly from this dirt road that I've marked over here, but also through open fields. A lot of this was filmed by the Russian forces, and I'm sure that we're going to get additional footage as the night goes on, because you could imagine that there would be a large amount of drone footage, not even just FPV drones or quadcopters, but just general reconnaissance drones keeping track of what's going on, that got an image of the artillery shelling and of the airstrikes. I have one of such video showing the Russian shelling. It's a 7-minute video showing how Ukrainians squads, and I think the largest one I saw was a 10-man squad, making their way westwards under the cover, or not, or under the shelling of the Russian side. They were using 152 millimeter guided artillery shells across the poles, targeting not just the roads but also the hedgerows that are adjacent to the dirt track, in order to prevent the Russian or the Ukrainians from taking cover in those positions. And so hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers during the nighttime, all the way to the dawn of the 17th of February, made this extremely dangerous journey. The majority that made it, that did this path, that were able to advance through this area, they were able to make it along the, you could say, 4-kilometer walk, or the potentially 3-kilometer walk to Lasochkina. They were able to survive that walk and avoid being killed by the firepower and the Russian forces that had at their disposal. But it is, of course, the case that a lot did not. I can't give you a percentage number yet. We don't have enough footage to get a clear idea, but it's definitely true that with the Russian forces closing in from all sides, enveloping them from 3 directions, using the vast amount of firepower at their disposal, and with the Ukrainians not having an organized retreat on the night of the 16th, that a lot of Ukrainian forces were isolated and targeted by the Russians, which led to high amount of killed during this withdrawal of several hundred, if not over 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers. But at the same time, it is increasingly likely that several hundred Ukrainian soldiers were not able to make this final evacuation on the 16th, and that they are still stranded within the city of Avdiivka. Now, this is to be confirmed as of the 18th of February, because really tomorrow is going to be the day where the Russian forces comb through the entirety of the city, especially through the center and the residential areas, and they get a good idea of how many Ukrainian remnants and resistance are left to clear up. And at that point, we'll get a good idea of how many were killed or are taking POW. So far, as of the recording of this video, I've seen about 5 videos of POWs that amounts to about 15 that were taken prisoner. And there are now videos coming out of some dead Ukrainians, but still not any massive influx. But regarding those remnants that have not been able to leave, at this point, their route is cut off. If there is any hope, then individual soldiers have to make a harrowing journey, several kilometers through enemy lines to make it to the other side. So it's just not feasible in a large scale sense. And so the Russian forces will likely capture or kill those soldiers as they go down fighting. Now let's look at the Russian perspective for how they were able to clear out the city. And so, in terms of the actual battle, there were 2 combined arms armies that led the effort, the 2nd and the 41st. And so, their brigades were the units that the Russians utilized to conduct their breakthroughs and defeat the Ukrainian defense. And they also had armored support from the 90th Guards Tank Division. And so, in the north, what you had was specifically the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade. This unit was involved in clearing out a lot of the northernmost residential buildings. So I'm talking about these 1-story houses, clearing them out one by one. And that's really something they were doing throughout the month of February. Some of their elements also pushing further northwards into the Khimik settlement, just to the east of the coke plant, getting that under their control. Their elements were also involved in storming the first facilities of the coke plant in the southern section of that industrial zone. And if we look at the southern or central areas of Avdiivka, they were also involved in storming those areas. And so we have actually some of the footage, not from the 74th, but actually from the 55th Mountain Motor Rifle Brigade, which was released yesterday on the 16th of February, which shows the Russian forces reaching a medicine clinic in Avdiivka and also reaching the city park and then raising the Tuvan flag and raising the Ministry of Defense flag, which is a symbol of the capture of that region. And then they also raised the flag at the railway station after the battle with Azov. And during that battle, they actually captured an Azov lieutenant who was the commander of a rifle company within their 1st Rifle Battalion. So after the 55th and 77th cleared out these areas, and of course, there has to be a process of going through these houses because there is the potential of the Ukrainians did lay booby traps. So there is still a combing operation through some of these residential areas. Nonetheless, these 2 brigades, they continued their advance south and advanced also along Industrial Avenue to put pressure on the Ukrainians and eventually reached the 9th district. And then from there, we had this video, which was released today, showing the Russian forces raising their flag over the Avdiivka City Council at the entrance to the 9th District. And the capture of this district and combing operations are now being carried out in tandem with the Russian grouping in southern Avdiivka. So that includes the 1st Slavyansk Brigade, which is a DPR unit. This DPR unit took over Zenit following the Ukrainian retreat and also took over the Chiburashka fortifications that are located over here on the Donetsk Ring Road. That's another fortified stronghold of the Ukrainians they were forced to abandon. And so now the 1st Slavyansk Brigade has been moved further north to clear out Avdiivka with support, of course, from the 35th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade and other Russian units that was involved in the southern sector. So now they're engaging in that operation. Now moving on to the coke plant, this is a very interesting development because a lot of people on the Ukrainian side did believe that even though the situation in Avdiivka was dire, that perhaps it could be salvaged in the coke plant and that a protracted resistance could continue here. But the Ukrainians did make the decision to withdraw from the coke plant to prevent a similar encirclement scenario from occurring in the coke plant as occurred within the residential section of Avdiivka. And so what happened was, really throughout the past week, the Russian forces have just not stopped putting pressure on the Ukrainians. They continued pushing from their positions on Industrial Avenue further north, taking over business enterprises, the fire station, as you can see on the map, and various other facilities that probably have tunnel entrances. And so they were directly threatening the Ukrainian garrison over there, leading them to have to either engage in a battle that would lead to extremely high casualties or elicit a withdrawal. At the same time, they were being heavily bombarded by the Russian side, as can be seen by these geolocated videos. So here you could see airstrikes on the coke plant geolocated. Here's another bombardment video. So these were dozens of these strikes occurring on a daily basis. And again, that was another facet through which the Russians put pressure on the Ukrainians, also bombing their supply lines and advancing towards those supply lines. It put a massive fear in the Ukrainians that they would be cut off or that they wouldn't have the option to safely withdraw. And so they made that choice today. The 3rd Assault Brigade, Azov, they withdrew, and the other elements that were in the basements of these facilities left as well, including the 47th Mechanized Brigade, towards their positions in Avdiivka. And once they reached those positions, the Russian FAB strikes continued, with the Russians hitting the retreating forces in this road junction. So now the DPR's 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, they have been filmed raising the Russian flag over one of the facilities in the coke plant, and there's going to be an extended Russian operation to go through the entire tunnel system, clear it out, because it could be mined as well. But in this withdrawal, the Ukrainians did likely abandon a lot of ammunition, which could be a future issue for them. But we don't know about any POWs from this section yet. Something that's really important to note is that the Russian forces avoided thousands of additional casualties that they definitely would have experienced had they gone through with a similar course of action that they had to go through in the Battle of Bakhmut, where they individually cleared out various residential districts within the city center in a protracted battle, which on a daily basis led to extremely high casualties. The Russian forces largely avoided such urban battles by finding the weak points in the Ukrainian line, exploiting them, creating a breakthrough that forced the Ukrainians to be routed and advance westwards. And so the Russians largely avoided fighting in costly urban battles within the train station, within Avdiivka city center, within the 9th district. The Ukrainians were really betting on being able to use this as a stronghold from which they could have sniper positions, reconnaissance positions, firing points to target the Russian forces in these dense districts with narrow roads. They were really hoping for that. Same thing with the coke plant. They were really hoping that they could take advantage of their dug-in positions that are protected from artillery and airstrikes in the basements to continue to protract the fighting. But the Russians were definitely aware of this Ukrainian advantage and worked their way around it in a way that would force the Ukrainians out. And so that is a massive success for the Russian grouping in this region, which right now there are estimates about the total grouping, not just in the battle itself, but generally in this entire sector. Originally, it was estimated to be at around 40,000, and now there are Ukrainian sources saying it's at around 50,000. And so now a lot of their offensive capacity has still been maintained, and they have momentum, they have morale on their side. They have, of course, the firepower on their side, with the Ukrainian sources admitting that they are outgunned 10-1 in the sector against the Russian side. On the entire front, it's about 5-1, but here it's even higher due to Russian concentration. And of course, the Ukrainians are inept in responding to this Russian artillery dominance because of a lack of counter battery fire. So the bottom line is that the Russian forces do still have a large pool of manpower that has not been exhausted, and that does still have tangible goals that they would like to achieve. And so I think it's important to look towards the next steps the Russian forces are taking. So at this very point in time, the Ukrainians they have thousands of men located within this narrow strip of land, located on a valley, located within this chain of several towns that was used to supply Avdiivka, and those forces retreated in a disorganized manner. They are obviously extremely fatigued after fighting in such a difficult battle, and of course are suffering from an acute shortage of ammunition. And so at this period in time, the Russian forces, they want to continue with their offensive activities, and we can see this based on their actions throughout the past few days, with them trying to develop an axis of attack further westwards from Industrial Avenue towards Lastochkine in order to prevent the Ukrainians from being able to dig in this area and create a new line of defense that is relatively close to Avdiivka. And so it's going to be important to see what the Russians do over the next few days to, first of all, attack the supply lines leading into Lastochkine along these 3 roads, but then to actually exploit their advances and attack directly towards that village, which is only a couple of 100 meters away. Another village that will be difficult for Ukraine to continue holding on to is Tepove, and that's because it's located on a valley. And previously, the Ukrainians were able to rely on the southern flank being protected because the Ukrainians had control over the coke plant, but now the Russian forces are consolidating control over it. So you're going to have an effort by the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade, of course, to continue pushing westwards. And the Russian forces do have the high ground looking towards the valley on which Stepova is located. And so there is a good chance that the Ukrainians will have to evacuate their westernmost positions within that village towards Berdichi. And the last thing I'll know about this general sector is that the Russian forces are still keeping their eyes out for capturing the village of Orlivka. And Orlivka is important because it acts as a hub through which roads branch out and connect together all of Ukraine's command and control in the region. So it's an extremely important village for the Ukrainians to hold on to. And then further north, you have Ocheretine. This is a very important village for the Ukrainians, as again, it's a logistics point which branches out onto the northern flank of the Avdiivka front, but also it's located on this key height that overlooks a lot of the positions where the Ukrainians are currently defending. So it does give the Ukrainians a bit of artillery cover and just generally high ground that overlooks the current battlefield. So that's a very important area for the Ukrainians to hold on to in the coming weeks. And then looking at the Ukrainian garrison, they do still have several thousand forces in the region. Some of their forces were not engaged in the battle directly. Some of them were fighting on the northern flank of Avdiivka, where fighting over the past few weeks has not been that significant. And so some of those forces are not that exhausted. And so I'm referring to the 23rd Mechanized Brigade in particular, and some other Ukrainian units like the 47th and the 31st that haven't been at ground zero that much. And so you might see more of those units now trying to pick up and fill the vacuum that was left by a lot of the casualties incurred by the Ukrainians directly in Avdiivka. And those units will likely be the ones holding the line in these villages directly to the west of the city. Now, with the end of this battle, the Russian forces have not exhausted their offensive capacity for the winter campaign. And in fact, they could even continue in the Avdiivka sector, but more generally looking out, there are still Russian operations that are extremely pressing that we could get into in detail in future videos. But just in particular, Novomikhailivka is heating up right now. Russian forces are continuing to attack in Hirhivka, although again, the Ukrainian defense there is very strong. There was recently a Russian push just to the east of Nevelska, which is another forward Ukrainian node in Donetsk. You have fighting around Pervomaiska, where the Russian forces have been putting extreme pressure on the Ukrainian defenders, where they're being enveloped. And most recently, there's been information coming out regarding a Russian push just to the southwest of Robotyne. And this seems like a very interesting point for the Russian forces to attack. You have the 71st Motor Rifle Regiment attacking on the outskirts of the village. I'm not going to get into details yet, but I believe there was already one Ukrainian POW in these Russian assaults, which were launched either today or yesterday, in that the Russian or Ukrainian soldier was captured from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. So this is clearly a reflection of the Russian forces continuing to take the initiative. And now with the end of the Battle of Avdiivka, some of those forces, if the Russians would like, could be redirected, or some of the resources going towards firing onto Ukrainian positions could be redirected towards other sectors where now offensives are going to begin to ramp up. And one such area, I won't say for sure, but it's not being reported on by Russian sources especially, but some Ukrainian sources are mentioning this, would be the Orkiv sector, where the Ukrainians are located on a valley. Robotyne is on a valley overlooked by Russian high ground positions north of Novopokrovka, to the west of Kopani, in this area over here. So the Ukrainians are located on a valley with supply lines that are very close to the line of contact, located on a salient that's enveloped on three sides by the Russian forces. And so it is a good area for the Russian forces to now take the initiative, fire heavy amounts of airstrikes and artillery, just like they did in Avdiivka, on the supply lines towards those Ukrainian positions, and then potentially close them out. And so I'll leave you with that. And thank you guys so much for watching. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.